Hi, welcome back again, guys. All right, so I love this question because this kind of regroups what we did last week when I was actually able to teach you. So give you a second to look at that. In the lungs, the movement of CO2 out of the cells and oxygen into the cells can be explained by which of the following processes? Well, if you think about it, there's going to be a lot more oxygen on the outside than on the inside. So oxygen is going to move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration, and energy is not needed. So that gets rid of the active transport, endocytosis. So that leaves us with B and D. Well, osmosis, when you think of osmosis, you should only think of water. So your answer here is B. All right, so what the heck does that have to do with what we're going to learn? So after we left transport, meaning the subject, active versus passive, crossing that cell membrane, we then looked at molecules that actually cross the cell membrane, and that was glucose. So we looked at how we made glucose, which was through the process of photosynthesis. Remember, what three things do you do to keep a plant alive? You water it, sunlight, and then you talk to it. So that's going to mean the chemical formula is H2O, sunlight, CO2 is going to give us glucose and oxygen. So we went through the process of photosynthesis, occurs in the chloroplast, yay. Well, that just gives us the glucose. Then yesterday, or whatever day it was, I taught you what happens to that glucose. The glucose then goes to the mitochondria, or to the cytoplasm, and we start the process of cellular respiration. The chemical formula for cellular respiration is the exact opposite of photosynthesis. So just a reminder, which organisms perform cellular respiration? Hopefully you said all organisms, even plants. So now we're at the process. We made the glucose, or we got the glucose either by going to McDonald's or something. We did cellular respiration. Now what do we do? So glucose goes in to the mitochondria, or stays in the cytoplasm, and we produce these units known as ATP. So we're going to look to see what ATP is, and that should be these notes. ATP is defined as adenosine triphosphate. Y'all have seen this quite a few times. I've talked about it. You've also seen it on tests. Now we're really going to look into this. So ATP is the energy storage molecule in a cell. The three parts are adenine, ribose, and three phosphates. So adenine, ribose is a sugar, and then you have these three phosphates. That's what the P's are. 1, 2, 3. That's why it's called adenosine triphosphate. So I think on your slide you have a second to draw it. So I'm going to give you a second to draw it. If you need to pause it here, Mr. Williams, you can. And the biggest concept I want you to get from this is the three phosphates. So let's look into this. Let's look to see how we use ATP, how is it different from glucose, and everything else. All right, so how does ATP work? So let's start back from the beginning, which we just went over. First, we got to make glucose. We got to take that solar energy from the sun and convert it into a usable form. The solar energy converted into a usable form is known as glucose. That occurs through the process of photosynthesis. Here are your reactants, here are your products. Light, carbon dioxide, water produces glucose and oxygen. Okay, yay, we got that. From there, we have to be able to get to the glucose. Either animals will eat the glucose, will eat plants or eat meat that has glucose, or plants will just move the glucose into a different part of their cell. So then that glucose molecule will go into the organelle known as the mitochondria. So we did photosynthesis, then we took that glucose and we put it into our mitochondria. We're still not there yet, meaning the energy in glucose is not readily available for us to use. We have to convert it into something else known as ATP. So ATP is the readily available energy that we can use. So we have already gone through this. Once glucose goes into the mitochondria, it is broken down. In fact, let's review. The first part, when glucose goes into the cell and it's broken down, is known as glycolysis, and that produces, or I'm going to give you another word, fulfills 2 ATP units. And I'll explain what I mean by fulfills. At that point, glucose will either go into the mitochondria or, depending upon what type of organism it is, will start fermentation. When glucose goes into the mitochondria, that's where we produce a whole bunch of, sorry, it's my phone. That's where we produce a whole bunch of ATPs. So let's look at what ATPs are. Okay, so let's see what happens when this glucose is brought into the mitochondria. So, as that glucose goes into the mitochondria, well, in fact, when the glucose crosses the cell membrane, it's split into two. At that point, it's called a new molecule called pyruvic acid. You'll need to know that. And then when these two molecules ride the inner folds of the mitochondria, they create these sparks. And those sparks are the energy that our bodies need. But in order to keep those sparks for later, we actually store them using the molecule ATP. I like to kind of think of ATP as a Tupperware container in your refrigerator. So let's think of it like this. So we're looking at ATP up here. When you think of a Tupperware container, you think of really three parts. You think of the bowl itself, you think of the food that goes in it, and then you think of the lid. So if you look at the food container with the food in it, it is a fully charged plate, meaning it has the energy in it. All you have to do is take off the cap and eat it. Well, that's just like ATP. ATP is a fully charged molecule. You have the Tupperware part, which is known as ADP, which is everything but that lid. You have the energy part, which is actually stored right here between the second and the third phosphate. And then you have the lid, which is that third phosphate that caps it. So as those molecules go into the mitochondria and ride those roller coasters and they create those sparks will actually bond to a molecule floating around known as ADP. Don't get freaked out. ADP is adenosine diphosphate, meaning it's two. So this is kind of like just the bowl of the Tupperware. It goes up to the mitochondria, it picks up a little spark, and it puts the third phosphate on, which is like the top of the Tupperware. At that point, we have made a molecule known as ATP, adenosine triphosphate. So let's think about it. If you wanted to go and eat the food that's in the Tupperware container, what would you do? You would take off the top. If you wanted the spark that is an ATP, how would you get it? You take off the last phosphate. So, this is just what I just said before. ADP will bond to the third free-floating phosphate, and in between those last bonds is where you get your energy from. A lot of people like this picture right here. ADP has some energy, not a lot. It will go to the mitochondria, it'll pick up that spark of energy, it'll cap a third phosphate on, and it turns into ATP. So ATP is a fully charged molecule. So when our body wants to use energy, it's going to take the ATPs, it's going to take off that third phosphate, and it's going to release that spark which our body will use. So, once again, driving this home, ADP plus one phosphate, so adenosine diphosphate, so two phosphates plus one phosphate, plus that spark of energy released from the mitochondria, will give us what's known as ATP, adenosine triphosphate. So in our cells, we are constantly cycling through ATP to ADP, ATP, ADP. ADP goes to the mitochondria, picks up the spark, ATP comes out. When we need to use it, we take off that phosphate and use the energy. Different organelles will use the energy. Sometimes energy will be released through the cell membrane. But that is how our cells use the energy. So here's check yourself, so make sure you write this down. Give you a second for that. Mr. Williams, if you want to pause it here too to give him a second to answer. I like to have him think, pair, share also. Okay, so this is a great question. First it is, what is the process that we have learned so far that requires energy? Well, I mean, you could say, well, metabolism, when we do this, work out. I'm talking about a cellular process. What cellular process requires energy? We just learned it last week, and that would be active transport. And then number 2, if you want the most energy in your diet, what should you eat in the food chain? Meats or plants? We've already done this on the test before, but plants are going to give you the most energy. When you think of energy, you should think of glucose, and then now you should really think of ATP. And that is it. So I will actually see you next time when we get into DNA. Just want to kind of recap. We did the cell membrane transportation last week, active versus passive. Then we went into what comes across that cell membrane, which is glucose, photosynthesis, how it's done, know that equation, know where it occurs, know who performs it, know things that affect the rate of photosynthesis, like type of water, pH. Then we went into, okay, once we have that glucose, how does our body use it? That's cellular respiration. So you have aerobic respiration and anaerobic respiration. Know which one's more efficient, which organism performs which one. And then we went into, well, why are we doing cellular respiration? We're doing cellular respiration because we have to turn that glucose into a usable form of energy known as ATP. I hope y'all are doing okay with this and you're understanding it, and you enjoy your lovely day. Bye.